An expectant hush. Good morning and welcome. I'm James Curran, Chief Executive of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and it's a real pleasure but also a real privilege to welcome everyone to this conference, Scotland's Environment Web Conference, Understanding the State of the Environment. Looking down the delegate list, there's a quite extraordinary cross-section of people who've joined us here in Edinburgh for this event. There's folk from government agencies, governments themselves, policymakers. There are people from industry and business, the third sector, universities, researchers, scientists, and of course many individuals as well. To me, that really just underlines that the environment and the understanding of the environment is essential for every one of us, and it affects every aspect of our lives. It's increasingly important to understand the environment, and it is increasingly important that every single one of us understands the environment. So there's a great turnout in the room here today in Edinburgh, but we're also joined by round about 1,000 live web stream users across the planet, and I'd like to extend a particularly special and warm welcome to people right around the globe. Many, I must say, are of course attracted to this conference for the privilege of hearing directly from Paul McAlevey and Cathy Maguire about the European State and Outlook report, which was released just on the 4th of March. That's a masterly report, if you've managed to read it, or at least the executive summary. It's a masterly report, I believe, spanning issues from the global right down to the regional. And for me, it certainly raises some quite deep concerns about the health of our life support systems due to numerous factors: population increase, natural resource depletion, and perhaps our adherence to traditional business models and business systems. But here in Scotland as well, I think we've had a remarkable collaborative, cross-boundary, cross-organisation and cross-disciplinary effort to create the State of Scotland's Environment Report, which is hosted, of course, on Scotland's Environment Web. And we'll be hearing from Nathan Critchlow-Wotton later on a little bit more detail about what that report is telling us about Scotland. But that report is just one example, I think, of the co-ownership concept that underlies Scotland's Environment Web. That is co-ownership of environmental problems and co-delivery of solutions to those problems. That's perhaps essential in these tough economic times, but also essential, I believe, for seeking out and delivering multiple benefits. And Joe Muse will be telling us a little bit more about that kind of approach later on in the conference. So, thank you from me, and I believe thank you from the people of Scotland for the many partners that have contributed and support Scotland's Environment Web. Partners who are sharing expertise, who are sharing data, who are sharing information, but most importantly of all, sharing the evidence that allows for better decision making. And of course, I'd like to thank the European Life Programme. This is the EU financial instrument that supports environmental, nature conservation and climate action projects as European demonstrators. It provides match funding, and has done for some years now, for the idea that we had back in 2010 for Scotland's Environment Web. That idea is at heart for an open data discovery portal for everything related to the environment. And I'm very pleased to say that SEPA has just agreed to continue supporting the project, to continue supporting Scotland's Environment Web beyond the time at which that co-funding from EU Life finishes, along with, of course, our many partners who have made SE Web what it is. For me, there are two important aspects or concepts that come together at this conference. Two issues that I've often talked about and have written a little bit about as well. It was the great psychologist Sigmund Freud who many years ago now said that humankind has faced two great outrages to its self-perception. The first of those outrages was the discovery that we orbit the sun rather than the sun orbiting the Earth. That in fact we're just a small planet orbiting a small sun on the outer edges of a small galaxy. The second great outrage was the revelation by Darwin that actually we're just quite a clever ape, descended from other primates, descended ultimately from the microbial soup that first developed on planet Earth. I think we probably need to add to that the third great outrage of modern times, and that is that we cannot manage the planet. We absolutely depend on ecosystems and natural capital for everything that we do, everything that keeps us alive. And that is nicely, I think, conceptualized as well in, and I pay tribute here to the European Environment Agency again, their model there of sustainable development. Not the usual mind model of sustainable development, which is three overlapping circles with a very small area in the middle, which you can make as small as you like, which you call sustainable development. No, their model is that environment underpins everything. It's essential to have a healthy environment, to have a healthy society, and it's essential to have a healthy society to have a healthy economy. And I think part of the concept of that is that citizens must therefore be informed and be part of the decision-making process using sound evidence and sound understanding of risk in order to determine what future as a society we want, the kind of environment we need and the future that we want to create on the back of that environment. So citizens themselves must be part of that understanding, part of that data collection, part of citizen science. And I firmly believe that if we can get our citizens interested in observing the environment, they'll come to understand the true beauty of that environment, and ultimately they will become guardians of that environment. So I think the rest of today is going to tackle some of those deep conceptual issues. I think it should be an exciting day. I wish the conference very well. The Scotland's Environment Web team will be around all of the day. You can contact them during the breaks or in the workshops for those of you who are here in Edinburgh. For those of us who are following us worldwide, for the global audience, further details and contacts will be provided in order that you too can join in the conversation, can make comments or ask questions. So enjoy the rest of the day. I'm now going to pass you on to Paula Charlson, Head of Environmental Strategy at SEPA, who will act as Master of Ceremonies for the rest of the day. Paula.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for that introduction to this exciting event today. I'm going to just chair the speakers today in the question and answer sessions. We're going to take questions after each speaker. But before that, I'm going to give you a little bit of housekeeping, a little too late, some of it. We have no fire alarm expected. So if the alarm goes off, go to the nearest fire exit that's marked and await instructions from the venue staff who will guide you out. Please switch your phones off or put them to silent. And as I say, there will be an opportunity to ask the questions after each speaker. In Edinburgh, there'll be a roving microphone. So if you put your hand up, and I can identify you. When you do ask a question, could you please state your name and your organisation, if it's relevant, and then your question. For the live web stream, you can submit your questions. There's instructions provided if you're on that web stream, and state your name there and your question. I'll be getting fed those questions after each speaker. Okay, so I think I'll just introduce our first two speakers. Our guests have come across from the European Environment Agency to address us today. We've got Dr. Paul McIntrye, who's Head of Air and Climate Change at the European Environment Agency. He's responsible for strategic development of the agency's work in a wide area, but to summarise, air quality and climate change. And with them we've got Cathy Maguire, who works on the Integrated Environmental Assessment and is one of the lead authors of the State and Outlook report that you're going to hear about today. Okay, I'll pass over to them.
Good morning, and thanks very much, Paula and James, for the introductory words. One of the concepts that we include in our State of the Environment report is about feedback loops. And when I heard you speaking, James, with the feedback loop on this microphone, I was thinking this is a feedback loop of a different kind of challenge, but it seems to be settled down now. So, thanks very much for the introduction. My name's Paul McIntrye, as Paula said. You'll tell from my accent that I'm Scottish. I come from Alloa, not so far away from SEPA, but I work in Copenhagen at the European Environment Agency. Cathy is going to share the presentation with me. She's going to take over towards the end of my presentation. Cathy's actually Irish, so you've got a Scottish-Irish double act here. But in the agency in Copenhagen, maybe just a couple of words about who we are before I get into the actual report. We have 215 currently colleagues in Copenhagen from 28 of our 33 member countries, so it's a bit of a chance that you've got a Scottish and Irish double act here today. We have colleagues from right across our member countries. The agency was created back in 1990 by the European Community, as it was then. There was a regulation which set us up, and it also set up something called the European Environment and Information Observation Network, IONET, which is a network that we do our job with, that we do our work with. So while there's about 215 of us in Copenhagen in the head office, we have a network of over 300 organisations and several thousand actual contact points across the continent who help us produce our work. And in fact, we have a couple of our focal points from DEFRA here in the audience today. We're an agency of the European Union. Our aim is to support sustainable development and to help achieve significant and measurable improvement in Europe's environment through timely, targeted, relevant and reliable information that we make available to decision makers, but also to the public. Every 5 years we're required to produce a State of the Environment report, and the 2015 State of the Environment report, as James mentioned, was published last week. We presented it in Brussels, and now agency staff are travelling to all of our member countries to present the findings of the report over the coming weeks and months, in fact. So we're very grateful to SEPA for the opportunity to come and present the report to you here today. It might take a bit longer than a standard 10-15 minute presentation because we're trying to give you a flavour of quite a complex assessment. So, SOER 2015. SOER stands for the European Environment State and Outlook Report 2015. It's a comprehensive assessment. It's an integrated assessment of Europe's environment in terms of the state, the trends and the prospects, and we also try to put it in a global context. It links explicitly to the European Environment Policy Agenda, and in particular what's called the 7th Environmental Action Programme. I should explain that acronym 7th EAP. The two main acronyms that I'm going to use today are SOER and 7th EAP. So, it's worth recalling that European environment policy is traditionally framed in 10-year now environmental action programmes. The very first one was adopted back in July 1973, which was just after the Stockholm conference on the human environment, which is often dated as the starting point of many environmental policies in Europe. we make the point in our SOER this year that the seventh Environmental Action Programme, although it runs to 2020 and sets the framework for European environment policy to 2020, it actually sets a vision for 2050, and I'll come back to that vision. But the point is that we're sort of halfway now between those 8 decades from Stockholm to the 2050 vision. And so we're about halfway there. So we use the State of the Environment report to say to what extent are we actually on track for what the vision has been. For the vision that has been established for 2050. So the State of the Environment report is a kind of baseline for European environment policy. Collectively, the State of the Environment report covers a wide range of topics, and it addresses different geographical scales. I was interested to read in Scotland's State of the Environment report, which we'll hear a bit more about, that, and I quote, "Any overall assessment is necessarily a simplification. Assessments are of the current average state. Some aspects of the environment covered by a topic will be in a better state and others worse. Equally, the condition of some areas is improving while others are worsening or staying the same." We in the agency agree. So it takes us a couple of years actually to produce the State of the Environment report given this complexity, and that's why we only do it every 5 years. And as I say, the state of the environment doesn't actually change on most occasions so rapidly overnight. We have 2 reports, and they're made available. There's the actual synthesis report, and then there's an assessment of what we call global megatrends. But in addition to those 2 reports which we've made available, there are 87 briefings on global megatrends, 25 European briefings where we look at water quality, air quality, waste, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. We have a series of cross-country comparisons where we benchmark countries against the distance to target in areas such as transport, energy, air pollution, etc. And then we have a series of actual country briefings where the 39 countries that we work with have themselves produced short summaries of the State of the Environment report in those countries. And then we had a peer review process whereby, for example, Italy would review the German State of the Environment summary and somebody else would review the UK. So it's been quite a comprehensive exercise. The report's based on objective and reliable information, and it draws upon a wide knowledge base from the agency and IONIT. Most of the information is presented online in a way that allows full data traceability. So we bring together the information as a resource for the environmental knowledge community. And Kathy's going to say a few words about that at the end to actually show you how you can drill down into the data, use the data yourselves, and even benchmark, if possible, the Scottish performance against the broader European performance. Enough of the overview of what's actually the report is how it's constituted. A few words about policy context. I already mentioned the 7th Environment Action Programme. The EEA, our agency, is a body of the European Union, but we're completely independent. That means we're allowed to criticise policy, we're allowed to say where progress is fast, where progress is slow, and that sometimes puts us in a very interesting position vis-à-vis European politicians, European governments, the European Commission and members of Parliament, but we are independent. And over the 20 years since we produced our first State of the Environment report, what we've seen is that the understanding of environmental challenges have evolved. We have a better understanding, and this goes back to the point that James made, of the interplay between economic, social and environmental trends. And to some degree this is actually reflected in European policy as it develops. We talk about the environmental acquis, the body of European environmental legislation, which totals something in the order of about 500 individual pieces of legislation going back to the early 1970s. And the focus of the acquis is shifting in terms of the time frame that it looks at. Many of the targets which are in place now address 2020, but increasingly they're being framed in the perspective of 2050. Where do we want to be in 2050? So the point of this slide is basically to policy framework to say, how do you achieve these broader transitions that we need to make in order to get to a circular economy with zero waste, zero impacts from air pollution, and a fully decarbonised economy in 2050. This is a vision which is set out in the 7th Environmental Action Programme, and it's quite a radical vision actually. If you go back to the early 1970s, there was a discussion around limits to growth. Some of you will be familiar with that debate. But now, the Environmental Action Programme, which was proposed in 2012 by the European Commission, adopted in 2013 by the governments and the Council of Ministers and by the European Parliament, is for the first time built around this concept of ecological limits. So, in 2050, we will live well within the planet's ecological limits. I personally, and this is a purely personal reflection, sometimes wonder if the politicians in the Council of Ministers who actually adopted this actually realised just how radical a statement that actually is, and to actually transform that into policies which will deliver us a circular economy where biodiversity is protected, where we have resilience and low carbon growth. If we were to achieve this by 2050, it would mean that a child who was born today would roughly spend half of their life in a low carbon society based on a circular economy with resilient ecosystems. It's a hugely ambitious objective. The synthesis report, which is what I'm primarily going to focus on in the rest of the time, tries to sort of bring together all of our analysis, and as I say, I'm not going to go through the 87 briefings simply because I can't carry all of that information around in my head. We would be here forever. But the synthesis report, it's structured in 3 parts. The first part sets the scene in terms of how European environment policy has evolved, the global megatrends that we're facing. The second part provides the information on the state, trends and prospects. And then part 3 reflects on the overall pictures and signals that this gives for policy, knowledge, investments and innovations to support the transition to a more sustainable society. The synthesis report is also based, it shows how we do our work, our business model. We use data, we use indicators to carry out assessments, and then we place the environment in its wider social, economic and political context to try and inform policy processes. So the key messages, to try and boil all of this information down, we basically had 4 key messages that we presented last week to politicians and the press in Brussels. First, environment policies work. It's worth restating it again and again. When they're well defined, environment policies, and when they're well implemented, they work. They've got a bit more complex in recent years when we've moved away from specific cause-effect relationships, point sources, to look at more systemic challenges, but basically they work. A second key point is that in many areas, Europe faces persistent and emerging challenges that are linked to our systems of production and consumption and a rapidly changing global context. The third point, neither environmental policies alone nor economic or technology-driven efficiency gains, and I'll come back to this point about the efficiency paradigm, efficiency gains will not be enough to drive what we consider are the fundamental socio-economic transitions that are needed. And lastly, it's not all doom and gloom. We see this as an opportunity for Europe, and we argue this is an opportunity to put Europe at the frontier of science and technology. It can stimulate competitiveness, create jobs, and contribute to economic performance. I'm going to come back to these a little bit in the remainder of the presentation, but there's one graph I'd like to show you from the synthesis report at this stage. We're launching the State of the Environment report at a time when Europe is talking primarily about jobs. It's talking about unemployment, it's talking about growth, it's talking about investment. So we used this table to say to decision makers in Brussels last week, jobs growth and investment doesn't necessarily mean simply cutting red tape and a deregulation agenda when environment policy is on the back foot. Green industries have prospered despite the recession in Europe. The environment industry sector, which produces goods and services that reduce environmental degradation and maintain natural resources, is one of the few economic sectors that actually flourished in terms of revenue, trade and job since the 2008 financial crisis. It's grown by more than 50% in size since 2001. This shows how environment policies, particularly in areas of waste, water, energy, air and climate, have a direct role in stimulating jobs and growth. But it goes broader than that. James mentioned the subject of ecosystem services. Environment policies have an indirect role in supporting our economic objectives by protecting the natural environment on which the economic prosperity and well-being depend, going back to the graph that James showed 10 minutes ago. These are often referred to, as we say, as ecosystem services, and I think SEPA has played an important role in recent years in actually increasing, outside Scotland as well, this understanding of the ecosystem services that we draw from our natural environment. The synthesis report presents a summary of trends for around 20 environmental issues, broken down by the thematic priority objectives of the 7th EAP, as I said. We give an outlook for the 20 years ahead, and we also try to put these in the context of the 2050 vision. Two key patterns are going to emerge from what I show you in the coming minutes. First, we've had quite significant resource efficiency improvements in Europe, but these have not been translated into increased ecosystem or social resilience. European policy has been better at securing resource efficiency than achieving resilience. And secondly, the long-term outlook is often less positive than recent trends. The detail of these is something that we'll make available. It's available on the website, but like the Scottish State of the Environment report, we use a colour coding approach to track progress. Scotland uses 5 colours, we use 3. So it's continent-wide, we try and use these 3 colours. It's a traffic light system: green for improving trends, yellow when the picture is mixed, and red when deteriorating trends dominate. We also give our assessment of whether progress towards policy targets is on track, and as you might imagine, that attracts a lot of attention from decision makers. When it comes to protecting, conserving and enhancing natural capital, the assessment shows that a reduction in pollution has been achieved through EU policies, which of course are implemented in the countries through domestic legislation. Significant improvements have been achieved when it comes to Europe's air and water. But when we look at biodiversity, a high proportion of protected species, 60%, and habitat assessments, 77%, reported unfavourable conservation status. Europe is not on track to achieve its overall target of halting biodiversity loss by 2020. When we look ahead, there is a more mixed picture regarding air and water pollution. One of the reasons for that is because climate change impacts are projected to intensify, and the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss are expected to persist. Moving on to resource efficiency, there's a little bit less red there in our assessment. The past short-term trends are encouraging. We've seen some decoupling of environmental pressures and economic growth. For example, European greenhouse gas emissions have decreased by 19% since 1990, at the same time as economic output has increased by 45%. The figure, by the way, for Scotland, the most recently reported figure for Scottish greenhouse gas emissions reductions is nearer 30% since 1990. Fossil fuel use has declined, as have emissions of some pollutants from transport and industry. And more recently, the EU's total resource use has declined. Less waste is being generated, and recycling rates have improved in nearly every country that we cover. But when we look ahead, there are significant challenges. Environment policies are working, but as the 2008 financial crisis and subsequent economic recessions have also contributed to the reduction of some pressures, it remains to be seen whether all of the improvements that we've seen will actually be sustained going forwards. This is an area in the agency where we're investing quite a lot into policy evaluation to try and disentangle the effect of economic recession from policy. How much of the reduction in pressures is due to recession and how much is actually due to policy? And that's something I can come back to later if you're interested. There's one red box there which got us into a little bit of hot water last week, and I'll just mention it anecdotally. It's a red box with the 20 years outlook on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change mitigation. The New York Times actually picked up this and wrote an article saying Europe is not on track to deliver what it's preaching for 2050. That was then picked up in the negotiations in the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is supposed to lead, as you know, to a new climate agreement in Paris in December. And some of the countries were saying, look, the European Union's own Environment Agency is saying that the European Union is not on track despite the fact that it's pushing us for an agreement. What we actually said there, and it's a subtle distinction, but what we actually said there was that on the basis of existing policies, on the basis of the policies which are in place now, Europe is not on track. But Europe has said that there will be additional policies that will put Europe on track. But as it stands today, Europe is not on track. Doesn't mean that the ambition isn't on track. A subtle distinction, but one that, as I say, attracted quite a lot of attention last week. When it comes to environmental risks to health, environmental policies have brought improvements in drinking water, bathing water quality, and exposure to key hazardous pollutants has been reduced. But serious health impacts remain in urban areas relating to air and noise pollution. We calculated that in 2011 about 430,000 premature deaths in the EU were attributed to fine particulate matter, PM 2.5 dust in simple terms. Noise is an issue that's not often taken particularly seriously in some countries. But in combination with other exposures that can have a significant impact. Exposure to environmental noise is estimated to contribute to at least 10,000 premature deaths in Europe per year due to coronary heart disease and strokes. And again, when we look ahead, the projected improvements in air quality are not expected to be sufficient to prevent continuing harm to health and the environment. And in fact, some of the health impacts we expect will worsen because of the impact of climate change. We pulled all of this together into an overall summary table for ministers. We presented the report last week in the Council of Ministers in Brussels to all of the environment ministers of the European Union, and we used this summary table. We call it the piano table. While the individual summaries give a useful snapshot, we tried to give this to say, okay, well, on a more aggregated level, where are we? And seen side by side, the overall pattern is quite clear. Again, we're making progress in improving resource efficiency in the middle bars, but that's not fully reflected in terms of ecosystem resilience or human health, the bars at the higher and lower end. And again, when you look to the longer term, the outlook is worse than it is in the short term. To dig, I'm conscious of time here, so I may speed up on a couple of these slides that are coming up. We then tried to dig down and explain this in a bit more detail. Again, we are operating in a rapidly changing global context. World economic output increased 25-fold in the 20th century, and it's expected to triple again by 2050. This has huge implications for our production and consumption systems. Perhaps most fundamentally, we argue it means that business as usual is simply not a viable pathway forward in the coming decades. In the past, Europeans were able to put a disproportionate burden on the global environment because other regions were producing and consuming far less, but this is no longer the case. Secondly, again, some of the changes that we see are systemic in nature. By systemic, and we define this in the report, we mean that they're complex, they have multiple causes, and there are many interdependencies between the underlying drivers and their impacts. This makes it hard to anticipate with certainty how environmental pressures will affect ecosystem resilience and human well-being. And the environmental pressures that we create are also closely tied to our social and economic systems, as I said, of production and consumption. Looking again at the subject of natural capital, there are several main reasons why we see a mixed picture in the longer term for natural capital. Ecosystems are complex, so there can be long time lags between reduced pressures and positive changes. Even when pressures are reduced, they can remain considerable, and external trends can counteract the positive effects of local efforts. You can illustrate this using the example of water quality and nutrient loading. Here we have a situation where policies such as the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive have delivered pollution control and reduced pressures. The average levels of phosphate and nitrate in European rivers declined by 57% and 20% respectively between 1992 and 2001. But more than 40% of rivers and coastal water bodies are still affected by diffuse pollution from agriculture, and between 20 to 25% are subject to point source pollution. So even with a reduction in pressures, concentration of nutrients are still high and affect the status of waters. This illustrates the need, we argue, for integrated approaches to manage problems like diffuse nitrogen pollution, to avoid shifting pollution across air, soil and water or moving it downstream. On resource efficiency, it's clear, again, that there are potential lock-ins that we need to avoid in the coming decades. We are quite open in our report in talking about the fact that change and decarbonisation requires quite a lot of political courage. There are political interests and economic interests which stand to gain from continued use of fossil fuels. We address this absolutely clearly in our report, and we basically argue that we need to tackle those lock-ins and areas where change is being resisted. And again, efficiency gains in one part of the system are often not enough and can be offset by feedbacks and changes in other parts of the system. Let's move on. On environment and health, again, we see the influence of the changing global context and the interactions of environment and socio-economic trends. And this is illustrated by climate change. Worsening impacts on human health have been projected, and without adaptation, we estimate that between 60,000 and 165,000 additional heat-related deaths per year in the EU are projected by the 2080s, depending on the scenario chosen. Changing settlement patterns also affect the exposure of infrastructure and populations to flood risk. I'm going to move on to the next slide here, which is basically to say, what should Europe do about this? So again, full implementation of agreed policies would go a long way, it goes a considerable way to resolving many issues. Environmental policies which are currently in place, alongside economic and technology-driven efficiency gains, though, are not going to be sufficient to achieve the 2050 vision. We need to tackle, we argue in the report, the production and consumption systems that meet our needs for food, energy, mobility and housing, but also our health, education and financial systems. We talk in the report quite a lot about the concept of a green economy, and that's one area where the European Union this year is seeking to come forward with more ambitious proposals to actually promote the idea of green economy across Europe. I'll just take one example which comes from cars and CO2. It's an example which we work with in the agency. We were asked on behalf of the European Union to establish a monitoring mechanism for the CO2 emissions from cars in the European Union. And we've done that. We've built up an extensive monitoring system. and it shows that the new cars being put on the market already in 2013 were achieving the 2015 emission standards on average. We're now tracking progress towards the 2020 standards, which are 95 grams of CO2 equivalent per new vehicle put on the market per kilometre. And we're likely to achieve those ahead of schedule as well. But it doesn't achieve the broader resource efficiency gains if you only stay within that efficiency paradigm. If you could imagine that we were all driving electric cars out to Edinburgh Airport, we would still be using a huge amount of resources for the production of those cars, and we'd still be stuck in traffic jams in Corstorphine. It needs a broader reflection, a transition to think about mobility and sustainable mobility, rather than staying within this efficiency paradigm which has defined many European environment policies until now. Looking ahead, we do see that European environment policy can address these challenges. There are some well-defined principles in European environment policy around mitigation, avoidance and the precautionary principle, restoration and adaptation, because frankly some of the challenges that we face mean that environmental change is inevitable, and there will be a degree of adaptation to unavoidable changes. So, it's not all doom and gloom. We talk in the report quite a lot about the subject of innovation, niche innovations, good practice examples that can be scaled up from the local level and can actually inform European policy. The press last week on the reports, there was quite a few articles talking about whether Europe can basically establish the equivalent of a Silicon Valley for green technologies. And there's some evidence in the report, some work that we've done to say that Europe does have a niche in certain key technologies. But again, this will require investments. Silicon Valley wasn't just built by freewheeling entrepreneurs and visionary venture capitalists. Even organizations like Google and Apple were able to draw on publicly funded research. So investment, innovation has a key role to play. A bit more on the subject of innovation briefly. We estimate, it has been estimated as more broadly, that the financial needs for investments to realise a low-carbon future in the EU come in at around 270 billion euros annually for the next 40 years. The growth of the environmental industry sector shows that even from a narrow economic perspective, investment in goods and services that reduce environmental degradation and maintain natural resources is a smart choice. A recent report in the UK, in fact, it was a DEFRA report on the costs and benefits of DEFRA regulations, showed the cost-benefit of environmental regulation has increased. With every pound spent on compliance and enforcement, we return £3 to society, according to the DEFRA study, through economic, environmental and health benefits. And again, the issue here is there is a huge amount of investment going on across Europe in the energy and the transport system. The Juncker Commission has put forward a European investment plan, and we're arguing, and we discuss this also with organisations like the European Investment Bank, that those investments need to be made in a way that avoid lock-ins into unsustainable technologies. Finally, the subject of knowledge base. We are aware that the knowledge base that we have now will not be fit for SOER 2020. There are new challenges, moving beyond the efficiency paradigm, having a better understanding of what we mean by ecological limits. We are investing with our partners to actually build a more fit-for-purpose knowledge base for the 2020 State of the Environment report. We need an improved knowledge on what it means to actually achieve long-term systemic transitions. And we argue that we need to strengthen the science policy interfaces and citizen engagement as part of this transition to a green economy. Kathy, when she takes over in a minute or so, is actually going to show how some of the information and the traceability, the data traceability of the information that we have in our report can be used by organisations like yours to sort of benchmark your work against what we've been able to do. So, we finish on a positive note. We do say it's not all doom and gloom. The 2050 vision is ambitious, but it's something which is possible. It's depending on the actions and the investments that we take today. Systemic change must deliver decent employment opportunities and fairness, but it also needs to respond to and respect environmental limits. And again, we believe that European policy on the environment does work, and we can be confident that the challenges ahead, which are enormous, are achievable depending on the decisions we take today. So thanks very much for your patience. It was a long presentation, but it's a lot of information we were trying to get through. Thanks very much. I would suggest, Kathy, can I hand over to you for a quick drill down into the information? Thanks.
So when we start to carry out an assessment like SWR, if we wanted to achieve its objectives of providing an evidence base for policy and decision making, but also, as we said, in expanding the knowledge base, strengthening this sort of science policy citizen interface, then we need to think not just about the content of our assessments, but also how we present them and how we make them accessible. And SWR 2015 is a bit different to some of the previous reports in that we went for these summary briefings, these 4-page briefings. And what they're intended to do is also act as a portal to the much more comprehensive underlying information, which includes the agency's monitoring data, our indicator resources, and our much more detailed assessments. And so in presenting or in publishing SWR this time, there are only 2 things that we've actually printed. Everything else is online. And this also allows us to ensure that there's full data traceability, that when we do our assessments, if you actually look at it, you can get right down. So I just wanted to show you, given people's involvement in something like Scotland's Environment Web, how we've chosen to do it and how you might be able to use this as a resource. So when you come to the website, you can see we've got the synthesis report, global megatrends. You can access all of these briefings. But I'll use the cross-country comparisons as an example. So if you go into an individual one, you have the briefing online. But as you scroll down, you have all of our graphs are interactive. So you can just look along and see the actual information. And if you click on this Explore button, it will take you down to the actual data. You can then download the data sets that underpin this. And actually recently, or last year, when I was given a presentation on Northern Ireland's state of environment, I was able to insert Northern Ireland data into lots of our stuff. So you can use it, you can play about with it, you can use it to make your own graphs and presentations. But that's just the data side. Also, EEA produces regular reports and assessments on a very wide range of environmental issues. And so within the briefings where we refer to this, again, you can link through to our underlying reports, because I think it's only through that full data traceability and access to our evidence base that means we produce a much more credible assessment. But I was looking at the Scotland Environment Web, and I just want to pay a compliment to how the approach that you've taken in your assessments, because the synthesis report this time for us, that sort of traffic light summary assessment, that was the first time that the agency has did this in a synthesis report. And I saw how in yours you also do an assessment of the strength of the evidence, and also the level of agreement amongst the people making that. And I think that's maybe something for us to think about, because again, I think it makes the whole process much more transparent, which again enhances its credibility. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Kathy, do you want to come up as well, just in case the questions are directed to you? Have we had any streaming questions yet? If you are on the live stream, now's your chance to get your questions through to us. But first of all, I'll take some questions from the floor on a very, very interesting presentation we've had from Paul, and a quick demo from Kathy as well. So anybody want to start? Excellent. There's one on the top there. Hector's behind you. If you could state your name and your organisation, please.
Good morning. Sorry, that woke you up, didn't it? I'm Dave Gorman from Edinburgh Uni.
Oh, that's not going to work. Stand up and shout if you don't mind, just now, till we get a microphone that works.
Yeah.
That was absolutely fascinating. Two interrelated questions, if I can, Paul, if that's all right.
Okay.
So one of the criticisms, so I Davey talking about the UK energy policy, one of the criticisms of the Treasury was the rather undynamic approach, where they simply projected forward and said, if life continues as is, the following costs of renewables will be thus, and therefore we can't afford them. So I wanted, part of the question was, I wondered how much you were able to, in the modelling, look at technology changes or cost reduction or consumer attitudes, and then say, well, actually, the straightforward projection would suggest we're in trouble, but it's the trends analysis would maybe. So that was one. And related to that, you talked quite a bit about system change, and I wondered if the EA had any thoughts about which particular systems would be priorities for change. So presumably the energy system, but is it all of the systems need to change, or the priority ones to do with energy or transport? So just some thoughts. But I thought that was fascinating.
I'll do that. We can both answer it.
You can have both have a go at it, that's fine.
In responding, maybe I'll just, for the benefit of the recording, repeat what I heard for the question to be. The first question, if I'm correct, was around the extent to which I'm trying to rephrase it in short words.
To what extent do we take on board changes in projections and model stuff when we were doing the outlooks?
Okay. And the second one was on the systems. Which systems do we prioritise? I'll start with the second one, and then I'll hand over to Kathy, if you don't mind, for the first one. On the second one, as I said, we're a rather small organisation, so we need to pick the issues that we prioritise. When it comes to talking about systemic change, this is something which is quite new for us as an organisation as well. We're only starting to develop our knowledge base, as I said. The systems that we particularly look at are the food system, the energy system, and the mobility system. So not to say that they're the only systems that we need to look at, but they're the ones that we're prioritising. Linking back to your first question as well, just to give an example of some of the work that we're doing with regard to the energy system, we've taken the 2050 modelling, which is, by the way, not done by the European Environment Agency, it's done by the European Commission, the modelling when it comes to the decarbonisation of the energy sector. We've looked at the trend, the projections for how and when the energy system needs to decarbonise. But what we've done is we've then taken our data sets, because we have data sets on all sorts of pieces of legislation, large combustion plants, etc., where we can look at the emissions which are coming from the existing power sector. So one of the pieces of work that we've launched, and we're just starting up on it now, is to actually look at the power sector in Europe just now, the expected lifetime of those power plants, and then to examine this question of lock-ins and to what extent are there lock-ins that will take us off the trajectory for the 2050 decarbonisation scenarios? So this is one aspect of looking at the energy system in a more systemic perspective. Within that, then we do some work around behavioural change when it comes to consumers. We look at the social implications, energy poverty, etc., is a matter that we also mention in the synthesis report. And we look also then at best available techniques and the application of best available techniques in the energy sector. So we try and map bottom up from our data with the more top-down projections coming from the modelling to see to the extent to which we're having lock-ins or whether there is actually the potential for systemic change in that particular sector, to give one example.
Okay, well, if I could just explain our approach to doing the summary assessments, because as you saw there were 20 of them in the synthesis report across a very wide range of topics. So when we're assessing the sort of past trends, they tend to be based on our data and our indicators. But the 20 years outlook is a more subjective thing. It's based much more on expert opinion, because there we need to think about current trends. And for some of the topics there are projections, but for some there aren't. So we need to think about, continued evolution of those trends, the interaction with the current policy framework, and then interaction with global factors and how drivers of change, that change is developing. So it is a more subjective assessment. And it's one of the things that we emphasise in that report is that 20-year outlook and those red things, they're not fixed. They depend on the choices that we make today, because they could very easily be yellow, they could very easily be green, but that will depend on what we do now.
Thank you. Very comprehensive response, thanks. Anybody else got a question? Actually, I'm going to come up towards you because my mic works and the other one doesn't. So if you state your name.
Towards you. I'm John Kerr. I work at the Science and Advice for Scottish Agriculture, and I wanted to pick up on the food system. So my question is, to what extent does the report take account of outsourcing our pollution value of our agriculture by making it impossible to do agriculture effectively in Scotland? That's pejorative, I know, and it's maybe not true, but if we outsource our production to grain-fed animal meat production in Argentina, say, does your report capture that? So our metrics might be going in the right direction, but actually the global metrics are going much worse because we can afford to have somebody else's environment polluted. So that's the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and the answer is, in at a conceptual level, yes, we do. We actually look at the distinction between production-based emissions and consumption-based emissions. If I take in agriculture, we specifically look at this question: to what extent are we simply exporting our pollution load to third countries? So it's a factor in the analysis that we've put forward. In the synthesis, we talk quite a bit about the consumption of carbon. So while there's some people who would argue, yeah, the European Union has been very successful in actually, as I said, reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 19% at the same time as the economy has grown by 45%. But if you look instead at the consumption and the imported carbon and the goods and services that are coming into Europe, the picture is less rosy. We address that head on. We show that even there, in the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a downturn in imported carbon from the European Union. But the reason we stick with the production-based approach primarily is because that's what's used in international negotiations. That's what's used to regulate emissions. But we don't ignore the consumption-based perspective, neither when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions nor when it comes to agriculture.
Thanks, Paul. Another question?
Marion Scott, the University of Glasgow. Forgive me, since I don't know the full details, but you made a point that basically the whole system is very complex and very interdependent, but in some senses your indicator synthesis assessment kind of still has an element of this is water, this is air, this is something else. And I wondered how you were thinking about developing, if you like, an indicator framework which was much more interdependent, so that you could actually see if we move here in air, we have this effect on water, or something of that nature.
Oh,
Another good question.
Kathy's one of the top experts on this subject, so I'm going to give her the mic.
Actually, this is something that we're very much looking at now. When we've said that we know our evidence base for SVR 2015 is not going to be what we need in 2020, these are the very questions that we're trying to address through a whole series of projects. Because it's not just the interlinkages between different environmental factors, but it's the interlinkages between the environment and the economy and society, and in particular human health and well-being. We know there are critical knowledge gaps there. And actually one thing that we're exploring is the use of integrated environmental and economic accounting to try and get a better handle on those linkages, and how we can derive from that small indicator sets that look at our different resources, both natural, human, social, economic, and the dimensions of things like efficiency, well-being, and resilience. So these are tasks that we've set ourselves, because in doing any assessment like this, you raise a lot of questions. And then it's up to us as well to think on the path to 2020, how can we try and answer some of those questions, so that every SVR is not just a more detailed description of the problem, but we actually make some contributions to developing that knowledge base. And EEA is coming together with our other European partners, so the Director Generals of Environment, Research and Innovation, and Climate Action, along with the Joint Research Centre and Eurostat. We've come together to form what we're calling an environmental knowledge community, which aims to enhance our cooperation to try and plug some of these gaps in the evidence base. And we're trying to do that through identifying strategic projects, and we're at the early stages of discussing and scoping that out. But we certainly know we need to make a contribution to providing some of these answers.
Paul, can I add just one sentence, which is we also are aware that to a certain extent the information base that we've been able to build up is dependent on legislation, not just legislation, also research, but much of the information coming into us is defined under water legislation, air legislation, greenhouse gas emissions legislation. But we don't want to be locked in. We talk a lot about lock-in, so we're trying to say, how do we move beyond that to build exactly this integrated analysis?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good response. We've got time for one more question. I'm assuming we have nothing from the web. If you've got any questions from the web stream, we can answer them later online, but you've got a minute to get your answer out. No more questions? One more? Excellent.
I'm Andre Hawke from the Tyne Brook and District Development Trust. Now, I'm here representing a very small coastal community of some 900 souls. And I'm just wondering if there's any modelling out there for how small communities can actually take part in improving the environment. You know, we have lots of problems, not just globally or Europe-wide, but locally. So do you have any models out there of how small communities have helped to sustain a better environment?
Thank you.
Yes, and at the end of the day, I mean, you make an excellent point. At the end of the day, all of this we're talking about at a global and European scale comes down to specific locations. At the end of the day, the environment is location specific. It's where people live that they experience their local environment. We do try and address the need for providing tools and good practice examples to people at the local level. We struggle a bit with a very basic issue, which is language. We operate in many different languages in the EEA, but we primarily make available the information on our web in English. So there's a benefit for people in the UK that maybe others would find, it's not so easy for communities all across Europe to work in English. But let me give you one very specific example. We have a website called Climate Adapt. So on the EEA, You can go into climate adapt, and it's all about how we're adapting to climate change. So irrespective of what we do on greenhouse gas emission, there will be an element of climate change projected which will happen simply because of the build-up of atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. So what we do is we look at local level projects, best practices, tools. How do people actually share experience in terms of what they're doing at the local level when it comes to flood proofing, when it comes to what we call nature-based solutions? How do you work with nature? How do you get the ecosystem services that James mentioned right at the very beginning? So yes, we are doing that. And that's just one example, which is in the climate adaptation area. So I would refer you to our website there and give us some feedback if you think it's hopeless. And if you've got some good examples yourself, there is a possibility to share that experience with us. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for your questions. And thanks both to Paul and Cathy for a really interesting and very open discussion. Thank you. You are able to stay with us today? Brilliant. Thank you. You'll be able to catch them both later, I think. I don't know if I want to go too close to the mics with the roaming mic, so I think I'll just introduce our next speaker from here, and that's Nathan Critchell-Watton, who's from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. His claim to fame for being here, actually, is he chairs the editorial group for the Scotland's State of the Environment report. Nathan tells me he's not going to give you much of the detail about the content, it's more about the process. You'll be able to ask him later about the content, but he's going to tell you about the...
Well, as soon as I can see this.
Okay, have you got it up? How they gathered the information for the State of the Environment report that you can find on Scotland's Environment Web. Okay, over to Nathan.
As soon as I can find the right button. Okay, as Paul has said, I'm a principal scientist in SEPA in the State of the Environment Unit, and I was the chair of the editorial group for the State of Environment report for Scotland. I'm going to talk today mainly about the process and the lessons we learnt on going through that process, rather than about the details of Scotland's Environment report. I'm very pleased to say the apocryphal headline of fogging channel continent cut off no longer applies, because the messages from the European Environment Agency show a remarkable degree of convergence with ours, despite the fact both reports were written pretty much independently, or very limited contact between us beforehand. So, looking at the report itself, just to give you some context of it, the State of Environment report, as has been mentioned, is part of Scotland's Environment Web, and that's a very large project, and it aims really to be the gateway to everything you need to know about Scotland's environment. Very ambitious objective, but we thought if Europe can be objective with a 2050 objective, ambitious, we can be equally objective here. So it's trying to enable the public to get the information they need to help them understand the environment. A very important part of it that James alluded to, it's a very wide base of partners. So there are partners from across the usual suspects, I expect, those organisations in Scotland that deal primarily with the environment or have large links to the environment. You can also see, which is very important, we're trying to increase the links between the environment and areas such as health, and between the environment and areas such as conservation volunteering, or volunteering generally. So there's a much wider base than has been traditional with State of Environment reports, which tend to be very much focused on just the science. The Environment Web is trying to make it a lot bigger than that. So really Scotland's Environment Web itself is about trying to take people on this journey, I guess, from being informed. So the State of Environment report is a large part of getting people informed about the condition of the environment. There's the ability to, as Cathy mentioned, you can, equally in the Scottish report, you can sort of get interactive, you can use the data, you can interrogate the data, trying to encourage people to some extent, to a large extent, to challenge what we've said, to enable them to feed back with queries they've got, questions and disagreements they have with the underlying data on which we base this report, and then ultimately to get people involved. So the lady, Mrs. Hawke from Thematic, was mentioning about community involvement. Part of the tools we're putting in here are things like a project finder that tries to connect people looking with work to improve their community with those who are offering opportunities or running organisations to try and encourage that. So really this is about taking people from being maybe passive or not interested ideally in the environment to start off with, moving them through to having an understanding, perhaps a passive understanding in the environment because we've said this is what the state is, and hopefully getting them on this trip through to actually interrogating it, thinking about it a bit further, drawing their own conclusions, in time getting involved, and then via things like citizen science, feeding those data back into the information section, into how we understand the environment. So I'm going to talk primarily about the report itself. I'll talk about the ethos of it, the structure, how we set it up, and very importantly, the contributors to it as well. So the ethos itself, we spent quite a long time discussing this with our editorial group. We want it to be engaging and receptive and accessible. We want people to be able to challenge it. I think the three things we kept coming back to is we want it to be trustworthy, evidence-based, and impartial. So we don't want to, we're trying not to preach to people. We're trying to present the information and allowing them, as far as possible, to draw their own conclusions. I can't really say we're trying not to preach to people, because in my accent I sound a bit like a vicar at the best of times, but we are trying not to preach to people. It's about trying to set it out so people can decide what they want to do with it. And again, great degree of convergence, Darwinian convergence here, on the approach we're taking. So at the top of the whole report, if you like, you have an overall summary, a simplification, which moves down through these assessments of state, our 5-banded system of assessments, through to chapters on which the report's based. They can go into topics which are around 3,000 words, about 6 sides of A4, deliberately, again, try to keep them fairly short, fairly pithy. Through to that, you can then access, underlying those, the reports through the library, and ideally into the data. Now, different topics and different pieces of data stop at different points in this process, but the ideal would be for everything to be able to say, well, this is the statement in the summary, and be able to follow that all the way back to the underlying data, and ideally to the raw data, again, trying to be as open and transparent as possible, because some of these things are obviously subject to interpretations. There's no one right answer necessarily. We want to try and say, well, this is our assessment, but here are the data you can base your assessment on yourself. In terms of structure, part of that is part of the legacy of it as well. So in 2010, we started the State Environment Report, and we applied for the LIFE funding. In 2011, we were awarded the LIFE funding around then, and we did release then a first version, a first step towards a State of the Environment Report, which looked a bit like that. Now, we'd gone down a certain route with that. We did then fundamentally rethink it in about 2012, I think, but to some extent we were still slightly constrained by what we'd already done. But we worked through from that, and in 2014 we published the State of the Environment Report, and we updated or completely reviewed it. Another important thing is that from now on, what we're aiming to do is have the data that is in there. The aim is for that to be updated as and when the source data is refreshed. So, for instance, we produce Water Framework Directive classifications every year. The objective is that those classifications, when those are updated annually, that's then reflected in the report. So the text wouldn't necessarily change, but the data would change. And I think the key messages, as Paul was saying, that they're not likely to change over a short-term timescale, but we want people to be able to go to the State Environment Report and trust that the data they find there is the most recent version. We haven't got there yet. I think there are all sorts of problems about getting refreshes and updates and all the rest of it, but that's the objective. Then the bigger review, which is when you fundamentally rethink how are we doing it, what's the evidence base, how do we want to derive our indicators, that would happen less frequently. Again, we set off with a lofty ambition of, I think, every other year we'd do that, and then having finished it, we lay down for a long time in a dark room and thought we're not looking at that for a few more years. And we need to think about the timing of that and when we link it up, before or after the European report, before or after other types of work. So we haven't yet pulled out when the next date is. So structuring I've mentioned, and again we had huge debates. I'll mention now we've got a really good editorial group that helped with a lot of these discussions, already were these discussions, there was no lead on it. And we discussed all sorts of ways by which you can brigade the environment. And we fully recognise, and I think we say in the report, the environment's obviously a continuum. There's no bit where water stops or where soil stops and water starts. One impact in one area obviously follows all the way through to every other aspect of the environment, to a society and to economy. So we looked at, but to make it comprehensible, to enable people to be able to go into it and access the data, we tried to think how the average user would want to look at this. And we thought people still, in our judgment, people still tended to think, the public tend to think of things as water or land or air. They tend, we think, to think in those silos. So we structured it around this. I think for the next version, we might look more at the ecosystem services approach. Hopefully by then I'll understand it. So by then we could probably be able to use it. So until then, I think we're sticking with this quite straightforward-ish way of assessing the environment. Within that, you've got these various then chapters, so a chapter on land, water, air, and within them again we break down these different topics. So for each of the water, land and air, you can say, well, what is it? What are we talking about? And we could talk about landscape, or we could talk about, whatever it is, wetlands or rocks, geology. Then we can say, what benefits do we get from the land? And we can broadly talk about those in terms of crops and livestock. We can talk about timber and forestry production. And then you can talk about the wildlife that is generally found on land, so farmland, mountains and uplands, woodlands, and you can expand these. The whole reason for doing this is that it's flexible. So if we think, well, actually there's another topic or another area that we should be putting in there, we might want to, or we do want to expand the wildlife to talk about urban wildlife specifically. There's a structure that allows us to put that in and rebuild it without any, hopefully, major grief entailed. Within each of these topics, then, you also have to structure the topics. And again, we looked at different ways of doing this. We looked at the ecosystem services approach, so how you break it down. But we went back to, in the end, pretty much a modified sort of DIPSA model, where you look at the drivers and the pressures, the state, the impacts, and the response to that. We did a slightly simplified way. We crunched it together. So state talks about state, pressures, and impacts. Again, in the 2011 version, we had an impacts section brought out separately, which talked about consequences. And then we thought, well, maybe that isn't helpful, and put it back in. And now we're thinking maybe it was helpful and we shouldn't have taken it out and we should have that separate. So all this will evolve, and it all depends very much on what the topic is you're talking about as to how it fits. So it might work differently for different topics. Then at the end, we talk about the response, so what's being done about it. And we try to make some assessment of how effective that response is being. But the main way we do that is through this state and trend assessment. It's interesting that, again, Paul and Kathy have mentioned this. It's fair to say this generated an awful lot of discussion, both with the editorial group and externally. There are arguments against doing this. It's obviously, the whole reason we're doing it is it's incredibly simplistic. By doing this, you lose a lot of the detail. You're averaging things. There are good reasons why this makes people nervous. But in the judgment of the editorial group, this is a good way of engaging with the public. It's a good way of engaging with policymakers because it's simple. So rather than give someone a 7-page diagram that sets out the condition of the environment, we're trying to distill it down. But we're trying to be very clear on where we haven't got evidence. We're trying to be very honest about the fact this is an expert judgment. This doesn't neatly map to X% of water bodies or rivers are in this condition or X% of land is like this. This is very much an expert judgment. And we've tried to be upfront about that and how unsure we are in some areas of it. So how we did that, we were very aware of trying to avoid bias in this. So we did it by getting individual experts, and we had around 109 experts, many of whom were in the room, I think, go out, and we gave them all a sort of questionnaire for each topic. So we'll talk about the state. How would you rank the state? What do you think the pressures are? What are the trends likely to be happening over in the future? We got those individual experts to carry this out, all independently, across partners, across academia. And then having done that, we brought all of those together. So we hoped by getting everyone to do it independently, they wouldn't be influencing each other and the loudest person wouldn't be pushing someone down a particular route. We then brought people together on a phone conference for a couple of hours, and I think I did 25, 30 of these, quite tiring. You have these discussions, which are really useful, and then you try and get to a consensus view at the end of it. I was dreading these. I went in thinking this is going to be just a car crash, there are going to be huge amounts of arguments, people falling out, it's just going to completely unravel. And amazingly, it didn't. So all of them except for one group came to a consensus, and the group that didn't come to a consensus, it wasn't that far off, and I think both were happy with the final results that and the justification we put on it. So that was quite interesting, in that I did expect this to be a lot more awkward than it was. And there's a very interesting paper written slightly worryingly by the CIA on the use of confirmation bias and bringing groups together about gathering intelligence. So that was quite good fun to read as well. So having got all of these, whatever it was, 30, 25 odd reviews together, the editorial group then reviewed them. And again, when we set this process up, we anticipated that when the editorial group reviewed it, we'd have to make lots of decisions and bang people's heads together. And again, there was actually nothing for us to do here. They'd all come to a consensus view. They'd come to a pretty much good understanding of what they wanted and what they thought was the right explanation and what the right caveats were to accompany these assessments. I think it was only one we made a very minor adjudication on. So having done all of that, and gone through this process, which took a couple or so months, it spits out your state and trend assessment at the bottom, which is this 5-band system. Willie Towers massively takes against the names for some of these categories, so we'll have to revise that if we do that in the future, about excellent, good, moderate, poor, and bad. But it's really about trying to say, well, where roughly are we on this spectrum and what the trend is doing. Yes, I think it comes up on there, but not here. But I think soil was one that is highlighted in the EA report again, that was one where actually people thought there really isn't enough evidence to assess the trend. So even with expert judgment, there's not enough evidence on soils in Scotland to fully understand what's happening with soils or what is going to happen with soils. Again, something picked up very much by the EEA. So, in terms of the contributions, it's really significant. It is a partnership project. It's involved people from a wide range of organisations. I can't remember how many now, but all these different topics were authored by different people from different organisations from across the piece. We had these 110 experts involved in the discussions of state and trend, who are all willing to put their names to it at the end. And very fundamentally, we've got the editorial group, a couple of whom are here. I think I've demoted Des, that's Professor Des Thompson, we should congratulate on being elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, I think, last week. So Des was one of our mainstays. And this is a really important group. incredibly important because there's a range of skills and experience and backgrounds in the group. I think we've got around 300 odd years of experience sitting in that group, and from a really quite a wide, broad background. So they were actually incredibly interesting because for a start we were getting to dabble in peer review topics that weren't really our area, so we got to stick our nose in places, which was quite interesting in itself. But also the group and the range of different things they could bring to that was really useful. I'll touch briefly on some suggestions of that for the future. So in terms of the lessons we learned, well, you'll remember that I talked about these, however many authors. Oops.
Whoever you are, I've always depended on the kind, strange.
So that's probably the key message. We've got 120 odd people that we had to try and encourage to do this. We didn't have any stick, we didn't have any mechanism to force people to take part. We had very high level agreements at director level and chief executive level that yes, this should be done. That doesn't always directly translate to getting someone to do something for you on time. So we had to do an awful lot of discussion with people to get this to happen. And it's very fitting to note that Vivian Lee is being led off to a lunatic asylum. At the end of this process, I think there are a few of us who, it was touch and go towards the last. I think one of my favourites was, I think, about 4 days to go pleading with someone, who I won't name, to please send in their final draft. Please can you send it, it's got to go live in 2 days' time. And the email came back saying, yikes, I'd better get started, which didn't do much for my blood pressure. So the whole experience was very much like herding cats. They were very pleasant cats. They'd got very good reasons for not doing it on time, but it isn't easy. And this is partly our own fault, I think. So you've got different stages of bringing people along with things. I think as the editorial group, we had a really good shared vision. We all worked very closely together. We had a really good idea of what it was we wanted to achieve, who we were trying to talk to, what the language should be, how we should set out the messages, what sort of things we should be talking about in this report. I think we then largely imposed that on the authors, and they weren't always brought along with it. So again, it varied between different individuals, but quite often we were telling them, well, we want this sort of thing, and understandably they didn't fully understand what we wanted. However, clearly you tried to explain it again and again, and they might not agree with it because they weren't involved in setting out, well, this is a structure, this is what your topic is, this is where it sits, this is how we want you to lay it out. So I think there's a real lesson there as well. In terms of the content, there are gaps in it, and there are gaps that we would really like to fill. And the part of this comes back to gaps in the evidence and maybe gaps in understanding. So some of the things we struggled on were the links between environment and health and getting a good, clear way of laying that out. Another area was cities and towns and the urban environment is finding some individual or organisation who is comfortable leading on that and trying to pull together that range of information. So there are real gaps there, and we're not sure what the solution is to filling some of those. Over 2014, I think the editorial group and Alex Salmon were both very concerned with independence. I think we were possibly more so. It's very difficult. There's a real tension. So we had this editorial group from across organisations, and I think generally we kept each other honest very well. So we'd say, no, that's not right, and we'd challenge one another. That did work very well. But I think there is an underlying question about the independence because we're all mainly part of government agencies. And for the future, when we try to widen that, it is quite difficult. We need to think about how we do that and how we allow the Safe Environment Report to have room to challenge certain of these pieces of work. I think there are definitely some good ways we've thought of how we can do that, but we need to think again if we do it. There are also gaps in understanding and in ways of presenting information. So I've taken one word out, so it's not attributable to any particular organisation, but this is exactly, other than that, word for word, a sentence that came in one of the topics. Anyone like to have a stab at what that actually means? So this is written, our audience was the informed and interested member of the public. So someone said, yes, this is written for that audience. No. Well, I've de-attributed what it was in terms of the activity, but it comes down to basically, we get something from this bit of the environment. And the sentence was not easy to understand. So there's a real thing about trying to explain who we're talking to and how we're going to do it and try and set it out clearly. This comes down to, well, as another underpinning problem perhaps was communication. So this is a very obviously informed, engaged and very attractive audience. How many people here have actually heard of the Safe Environment Report up until a month ago? Put your hand up if you knew it existed. Not too bad, so that's maybe a bit more than a third, maybe edging on towards half. But you're the half of people who've bothered to give up a day of your time to come here and listen to us talk about the State of Environment Report. So you'd hope that we were hitting 100% here and that we're doing better than 50% in other areas. So I think we need to learn a lot about communication. Part of the problem with that is it's actually quite hard to sell the State of Environment Report because by definition it's a synthesis report. There's nothing revolutionary in it. It's not presenting any brand new research. It's pulling things together to try and tell a cohesive story about the environment. But there's nothing you can really hook a news story onto. But I think there's definitely a lesson there about really how do we communicate this better. And the audience, again, I think we were clear we were talking to an informed and interested member of the audience. I hope we, by and large, hit that brief. But that isn't the whole world. That's a very small subset of people that we need to talk to about the environment. And we haven't gone that step further to put a veneer on top of this to take this hopefully impartial and unbiased assessment and stick something on top of it that makes it actually grabbable and more interesting and more engaging for the general public. And then the shared vision, I think, is a really important lesson for the future, that we need to collaborate more at the beginning, and rather than say this is how we're going to do it, we need to bring people together and get a shared view of how we're going to talk about the environment. Another thing that came out of that is that we did this deliberately. We set it off and we asked individual authors to write their sections, and then we spent an awful lot of time trying to bring those together to make the tone consistent. I think probably, actually, you need to try and get individual experts to draft their sections and then have one or two people who then pull it all together and they effectively rewrite it rather than try and get the author to write it in the right style. So that was a real thing. We thought we were saving time and effort, and actually probably took us longer and annoyed people more because you have to go backwards and forwards tweaking what they'd written. The really important point is it's very important to have a good editorial group. There's a huge background experience, a lot of wisdom in this group, obviously, and it's a really very good supportive mechanism when you're doing it. You really needed this when you're feeling particularly beaten down by it, to be able to go to people who are sharing the pain and could help you with it. Now, it's definitely worth highlighting Karen, who's quietly sitting there, who's done a huge amount of work on this as well, probably largely unheralded, partly because she goes to the backup photos, but she did an awful lot of work on this individually. So if we put all this together, we've got these state and trends assessments, we've got people writing topics, we're bringing together data. What we hope we've done is given the best picture of the state of Scotland's environment yet. But there is a question mark, and the whole point is it's open to challenge. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. That was a good description of the process, warts and all. You can judge the final product by going on to Scotland's Environment Web and having a look at the State of the Environment Report. But we've got about just under 10 minutes for any questions to Nathan about the process. Anyone want to start? Okay, while you're thinking, do you mind taking a question, Paul, that's come in from the streaming?
Colleagues, that's the main bit, that's the additional.
Okay, so is new or novel legislation required to help to improve the environment? And specifically, new water legislation to lead to improvement of aquatic environment. So, yeah. You talked about some of the policy and legislation, but what do we really need to achieve the goal?
I thought I was done for the
You
day,
got away from
but we always make the statement whenever we're asked about legislation that we don't propose legislation, we provide the information, and it's up to the politicians to make legislation. But yes, I think is the answer, that we do need modern and updated legislation, including in new areas. I mentioned in my presentation, I'll give 3 very quick examples, very quick. One, I mentioned in my presentation around the subject of the circular economy. The European Commission has promised that by the end of this year it will come forward with new legislation on waste and the circular economy and resource efficiency. There was a proposal which was put forward about 18 months ago. The new Commission, which came in last November, withdrew that proposal because they said it wasn't ambitious enough. So we're looking to see that new, highly ambitious circular economy proposal by the end of this year. That's one area. On water, it's not my own specific area of expertise, but I do know that the Water Framework Directive has undergone what's called a refit. evaluation and an examination of the extent to which the Water Framework Directive is actually delivering upon the objectives that were established. And I don't know if the conclusions around the Water Framework Directive have actually been finalised yet. I don't believe they have. And the third one, and the most obvious one, is around energy and climate change. The European Union has said that just in terms of the targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we have a target of 20% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2020. We've basically achieved that and will achieve it ahead of schedule. The European Union has decided that by 2030 we need a 40% emission reduction compared to 1990 levels. So that headline objective has been defined, but the legislation for how you actually get there is coming forward this year and next year. So before Paris, there will be the climate conference at the end of the year. There will be legislation to reform the emissions trading system. And then next year, there will be further legislation tackling agriculture, transport, and some of the non-trading sectors. So legislation is definitely still needed.
Great, thanks, Paul. Sorry for putting you on the spot there. So, have we got any questions for Nathan on the process? Okay, we've got a couple. I'll come up this way first. Get this little guy off me.
Hello, I'm Graham Russell. I'm the Planning and Environment Officer for Royal Yachting Association Scotland. I was really interested to hear about the process here. There's a lot of marine stuff going on, and I think there are a lot of lessons that can be transformed, can be taken from this process to applying in the very difficult situations we have with lots of stakeholders, lots of specialist knowledge, and how we can efficiently pull it all together.
Thank you.
It's very good. Actually, part of that fits into something we've been looking at recently. So we've done this work on defining the state. What we're next trying to look at is how effective different measures are to protect and improve the environment. And only recently I've come across a very useful, it's actually a software package that looks at multi-criteria decision making, very complex, but basically it's an incredibly good way, and it links back to this work on indicators, and through that it allows you to say, well, how much of a change do you wish to make to, say, water, and then what the impacts will be on air. So it helps you try and balance different competing demands, which is a problem across all sectors, and things like the land use strategy are trying to resolve that. But this question of how you balance different priorities, different endpoints you want to get to is really interesting, and something we're trying to look at if we next time we iterate this, as to how you bring that sort of assessment process in to make it both more transparent and more flexible, perhaps, as to what people want their endpoints to be. So that's a really good point.
Thanks, Nathan. There was a question up top. No, I'll come up. I think it's better for the web stream.
Dave Gorman again from Edinburgh University. Two thoughts, Nathan, just interested in your views. First one is, well, you are at Edinburgh University, so I would say this, when you're in the 14th ranked university in the world, we have 33,000 students and 10,000 staff. So my first thought is around the involvement of Scottish universities going forward as to whether there's more there to build in. But the second one is, I was in this building a few months back on a Sunday, feeling a bit annoyed actually because I had to do some work, and the idea was that we would expose some of our young people to some of the questions that we thought that we had to solve, some of the problems. And it was called a hackathon. For those of you under 30, you probably know what these things are. I didn't know what it was. So anyway, came in on a Sunday feeling a little bit grumpy that I was going to spend a whole day listening to what I thought might be some rather rubbish ideas, to be honest, from people who'd only just found out about the topic the day before. What we actually found was extraordinary ideas, and some of them, we have an innovation lab within the Carbon Centre in the centre of the city, and we are hoping to maybe take some of those ideas forward. And I wondered whether there's something about complementing going forward the process of expertise. You clearly need the experts, and you need people who understand these things, with some kind of youth element or some sort of prediction markets or some sort of different way of synthesizing the evidence and taking a new approach and almost comparing the two, for example. So, just some thoughts.
Thank you. So, Nathan, what are you going to do next time?
Okay, next trick is, so I think, yes, definitely more academic involvement in both in helping to draft and put together the topics of the State Environment Report, and also to help with these judgments of state and trend and effectiveness of measures. And we did involve quite a few academic partners, including some from Edinburgh University. I think what we probably didn't do was trail this early enough and explain early enough what we wanted and who we wanted to get involved. So we probably lacked from getting the uptake that we were after, but we were definitely very keen to involve that. We got 102 organisations or individuals. We could have run the process with a couple of hundreds, I think, so it would be good to have definitely more involvement from that side. The latter point about hackathons, I think Jo can maybe touch on briefly in her talk, putting her on the spot. But there's also has been on SE Web before, there's been a youth discussion, and Paul Griffiths is lurking, you find him, he's quite tall. If you spot him later on, there he is. See, I told you he was tall.
It's up the corner there.
So Paul can talk a bit more about the youth discussion, but there was that work. Again, one of the aspirations, well, there are two separate aspirations we set off with. One was to aim to have this is the state of Scotland's environment, but allow people to cut it regionally, to say, well, this is the area I'm interested in. Is there some way of cutting from that the different metrics and the different indicators and trying to present a local scaled state of the environment assessment? We tripped up on that technologically, it's very difficult, and also trying to work out scientifically how to cut your indicators up for different areas is very hard, but it's something we'd like to revisit and look at again. Another part of this was looking, again, the initial discussion was around, well, this is the state of the environment as set out by the great and the good, and this is our hopefully trustworthy and impartial assessment, then allowing space or some format for others to put their own views in about what should be done, their assessment of how well they think the state is and how well you think the policies are applying to fix that. And again, it gets very difficult, and I think to underpin all of that, what you need almost first of all is working out how you're going to communicate it and how you're going to get people involved. So what we've tended to do is put a huge amount of work into deriving, well, this is how people can get involved, and then 7 people turn up on a dog. So it's actually we need to work out how to communicate things better and get that engagement and involvement to make it worth the investment of the infrastructure to support it. I think it's a really important point, and again, the EEA report and again, the Scottish report, it talks continually about interaction and engagement and getting people involved, and the only way we're going to fix these complex, intractable and interrelated problems is from the bottom up by engaging people, and especially the young people, in actually trying to do something about it, and fundamental shifts in behaviour that are necessary. So we need to work more, and part of what SEWeb's trying to do is help bring about that shift, but it isn't easy. Otherwise we'd have done it already.
Great, thanks Nathan.
Thank
I'll
you.
let you leave the podium. I'm going to invite our last speaker for this morning is Jo Muse, who's provided the project management for the Life Plus project since 2012 with lots of able helpers who are most of whom are here today anyway. So I think, Jo, you're going to tell us about the journey that you and the team have been on for the last 3 years and managing a Life Plus project with the partners to deliver the gateway to everything you want to know about Scotland's environment. Thanks, Jo.
Yes, thank you very much. And good to see you all here today. Thanks very much for your time coming along. I work for SEPA, Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and in January 2012 now I joined the Scotland's Environment Web team. We have a delivery team that comprises of a wide range of expertise on science, on data analysis, spatial data, web development, communications, project management, and that team really complements itself. And we work together with our colleagues and our partners to deliver the aims and ambitions of the Scotland's Environment Life project. So what I'd like to do today, as Paula alluded to, I want to take you through the journey that we've been on over the last 3 years as part of the Life project. And the journey we've taken to get to where we want to be in towards becoming the trusted gateway to everything you want to know about Scotland's environment. That's no mean feat there, just that broad statement. So it really started from the seeds of an idea back in 2010, when it was being increasingly aware that there's so many organisations involved in monitoring the environment, there's so much data out there. I think as organisations we're very data rich, we can often be quite information poor in terms of turning that data into something and using it as widely as possible. And a lot of this information was scattered across many different websites. So from a user's perspective, where you want to engage with and use environmental data, which really does underpin so much of what we do in terms of analysis, policy making, legislative making, prioritisation, identifying actions going forward, it's where do you go to find that data? And what's the trusted and sources of that information. So what we wanted to do is create a centralised gateway to data information published throughout Scotland. The project that we're looking at was very much aligned to the Inspire Directive, which was around creating a spatial data infrastructure, encouraging improved sharing of environmental spatial data across the public sector, but also facilitating better access by the public to data. And this is also very much aligned with the creation of the Scottish Spatial Data Infrastructure, where a lot of Scotland's public sector spatial data was published. We also wanted to tie in with the emerging movement around shared environmental information systems. And that was really where things were starting to move away from paper-based reports to a system where information management is really as close to the possible as source as it is. And we make that information available to users in a much more open and transparent way. And also when we started looking at horizon scanning, there was such a rapid pace of technology, not just in terms of technology and software development, but how the technology that was available to citizens, to our customers, and how people use that technology to interact with and find information and data. We wanted to make much better use of that in terms of achieving our ambition to becoming the gateway to information on the environment. So out of the seeds of an idea grows a project, and out came Scotland's Environment Web. Now, its long-term intention was to present a wide view of Scotland's environment, and phase one was setting up the infrastructure for the website, bringing together descriptions of the environment, and Nathan's alluded to, it really was the place where we published the 2011 State of Environment Report. And in November 2011, a new website was born. And this really was the start of the Scotland's Environment project going forward. So we had the 2011 State of the Environment Report. We had around 50 map layers on the maps, which was a great start. We had a search for library documents and some quick links to other information. So a lot of potential, but it created that web space that we could go and innovate and identify new solutions going forward. Around the same time as the website was created, we had approval from the European Life Funding, and so a new phase began on our journey in phase two. So in December 2011, we had phase two of the LIFE project starting, and we had four main objectives to delivering that LIFE project. We wanted to develop and create an inclusive partnership program. We wanted to bring together key data providers and key data users to develop the Scotland's Environment Web project. As I mentioned before, we wanted to help promote the expansion of a shared environmental information system, and that was how Scotland as a member state can share more of our information to the European Environment Agency and to other member states in terms of data sharing, but also creating a much stronger shared environmental information system across all the data publishers throughout Scotland. Providing better access to data and widening the use of data information helps to improve understanding and also feeds into better prioritisation of actions. And also, it wasn't just about the website, it was very much about engaging with the public, providing access to high-quality online information, engaging the public in discussion, monitoring and action to protect and improve the environment. So behind every great project, we have a great partnership, and I think we've had thanks today to all the partners involved. But it's true, I mean, we couldn't have got to where we have today without the partners. And Scotland's Environment doesn't publish its own data. It harvests data from other organisations that publish data. This is only ever going to be as good as the information and data that we can get from our partners. We also wanted to make sure that what we were developing under the LIFE project was going to be a longer lasting legacy to provide a resource that we could all use. So you really need to engage with the people that you want to work with to make sure what they produce or what we're producing, what we're developing is going to be useful to them and it's going to be of benefit to them. And it's not just those that are on the steering group and the management group, but there's a whole other network of partners that we're trying to engage with in terms of data producers. And this really is just a flavour of the whole range of organisations that we're working with. And what we're trying to do is take the data and information that's published and transform it into something that gives it a much wider user base, a much greater profile, and in extending the reach and influence of what we're trying to do. Data. Scotland's Environment Web is data hungry. What we want to try and do through the kind of gateway portal concept is significantly increase the amount of data and information that can be accessed and viewed through the website. So the whole premise of Scotland's Environment Web is to provide this gateway. I like to think of it as a kind of shop window as well, to say, well, okay, regardless of who publishes information, I'm interested in a particular environmental topic. So I come to Scotland's Environment Web, I type in my particular interests, and I can find across the board from a whole range of sources and organisations what information is available, where I can get it, and who I need to go to get more information. We've grown from the 50 data sets that we started out with to over 300 spatial data sets now, which is fantastic. And we're developing tools both for data visualization and mapping, which I'll come on to, basically to turn some of the raw data into much more usable formats. And the journey that we're taking is now very much aligned with the Scottish Government's open data strategy, and that's the open data strategy that was just published in February of this year. And essentially what we want to try and do, aligning with the open data strategy, is making data much more easily discoverable, accessible to anybody that wants to use it, and freely available to use. And very similar to what Scotland's Environment Web does, open data really wants to help people make better use of data, and it really does help improve public services that are on offer. We want to deliver wider social, environmental, economic benefits to more innovative use of data, and also it helps in terms of our accountability and transparency in terms of making that data more widely available. Again, as noted before, we wanted to try and go along the routes of encouraging the shared environmental information system. And that's where we're moving away from single-purpose data publication to publishing data, collecting data and publishing at source, and getting it out there in an open data format that other people can do things with. So essentially, we have our partners as the data providers. We want to, using standard data formats and linked data, obviously driven through the Scottish Government Open Data Strategy. There's a whole range of different applications, and we're going to hear more about the journey that CWeb's been on, that open data journey, at the Open Data Workshop later this afternoon. And just pointing on, I think it was Dave's comment about the hackathon, this is where this fits really nicely. So what Scotland's Environment are doing in the next couple of months is we're actually engaging with university students to say, give us your ideas in how we can look at, for example, analysing new data analysis, new data mashups from data from different sources, and what new analysis do you come up with. Getting graphic designers, game designers involved in terms of, with this data that's available, can you come up with new ideas to help people engage and interact with and understand the environment? And also in terms of product designers, say, and maybe app developers, can you come up with new equipment to collect data, new apps to collect and record data, really to engage with Scotland's citizens? So we're just dipping our toes into the hackathon arena. I think it's got huge potential. We've heard of the successes of the Edinburgh University. And I think if we can really make a go of this one, it could be a really exciting journey we take on in terms of tapping into new creative minds that are kind of out with our comfort zone, I think, in terms of how we develop new ideas so far. In terms of improving effectiveness of policy development and being able to target and prioritise measures to address the various environmental challenges, being able to find data but also get information on that data is absolutely critical. And what's really important is how people use data. We want them to use it to inform, to understand, to decide, and actually ultimately to behave, so to change behaviours. And these are some of the points that Scotland's Environment is seeking to develop. We want to streamline access to multiple sources of data information, providing that single authoritative view of Scotland's environment and how it's changing, present data from multiple sources in one place, in a common format, in interesting and dynamic views, helping people to explore new relationships in data is one of the kind of areas we think is really quite exciting. As I mentioned before, getting the public engaged and involved in discussion and action. And in terms of Objective 4 of the project, engaging with Scotland's citizens, there's been a lot of work in terms of engaging them in debate about environmental priorities, trying to understand what interests them, and actually what was quite interesting, what we think the public understanding about the environment can be very different to what they actually feed back they understand and what really interests them, and getting them involved in monitoring, action, education, and the workshop this afternoon with Paul and Stuart around engaging young people in citizen science will give you a flavour of the kind of work we've been going on in that area. So we had all this work going on in terms of getting new data, developing applications, writing the State of the Environment report. But essentially, you can have a website, but if no one uses it, it's kind of pointless. And we really need to start thinking about who are our users and what do our users want. And what was interesting in the process we went through with Edinburgh University and did extensive user engagement workshops, what we thought users wanted and how we thought they interacted with data on the web was actually quite different. But what was really interesting is we've got some really good feedback, and that fed into the design of the new website. And we had workshops ranging from members of the public to community groups to students to policy to the agency. So it's a really good cross-section, and we kind of gave them exercises and scenarios to say, okay, we want you to find this bit of information about this topic and just let them free on the web and try to understand how they search for information, how they interact with information, what was good and bad about the data information that they found along their journey. And then we also got them involved in some design work in terms of the key features they liked about Scotland's Environment Web and some of the design, what they might want to see as part of the design elements. So some of the key feedback that they had, they wanted to view trusted, authoritative data information. So the default position for most people is go to Google, search what you want on Google. But from the Google research listed items, they weren't quite sure who was publishing the information. Was it the most up-to-date information? Was it quality information? Was it trusted? So by virtue of the partners that were involved in Scotland's Environment Web, they really felt that they knew what they were searching and finding on the website was trusted and authoritative. They want to search and find information quickly. Basically, if they can't find it within 2 or 3 clicks, you can forget it, we've lost them. So getting them on that journey that can get them to that point of interest quickly and get them to read information both within Scotland's Environment website, but also ensuring there's that connectivity with other related websites, the websites of our partners and other associated sites. They also want to be taken on a journey of discovery. So there's an element of, well, I'm interested in this, so I'm going to go and look for it. But there's also, you want them to help take them on that journey. Well, actually, I didn't know I was interested in this, or I didn't know that information was there, and kind of widen their horizon of what's available. Much more images, much less text. I think that was quite an interesting lesson that we learned, particularly for the State of Environment report, where the previous website was a lot of text, quite related to our kind of usual way of writing science publications, policy documents. So you can see that reflected in the structure of the State of Environment report, where it's snapshot bits of information. You can get a snapshot, you can read more if you choose to, much more image-based. People also want to interact with the data, they're interested in the data. And the tools that can take, I'm not a data analyst myself, so spreadsheets give me the fear, but some of the tools we have in terms of data visualization that instantly turn thousands of rows of complex scientific data into graphs and presentations is great in terms of quick analysis and interpretation. And the localized view, so our postcode search, people want to know what's going on around them. One of the most widely used tools on the website is a postcode search. Where's my house? Where's my community? What's going on in my community? So doing a lot more work in the future about how you can take things like the National State Environment Report, make that much more relevant to people in their local community and their local neighbourhood is where we want to go in the future. So who are the users of Scotland's Environment Web? This is one of the things we found quite challenging when we had the live bid, because when we wrote it back in 2010, we wanted to be everything to everybody. There's so many different stakeholder groups and partner groups. It actually, I think, to some extent led to a bit of confusion about who's the website aimed at, who the product's aimed at. So going forward, we really want to start homing in on our target audience. And that target audience is those who are seeking to get a broad overview of the multiple aspects of Scotland's environment and also start exploring those interrelationships. They could be interested members of the public, generalist professionals. Now, when I say generalist professionals, it's those that are looking for that broad overview. So they might be considering the different aspects in relation to environmental policy, environmental assessment, but also those that may have a specific interest but want to see that specific interest within a broader context of the environment. Also things like community, third sector groups and education sector. Now, that's not saying we're not going to help those that want a more specific, more technical data view. They're very important, they're very great users of data, but what we'll probably do, we can't be all things to all people, and we don't want to kind of for them dumb the website down too much, I suppose, because they have quite different needs in terms of interacting with the data. So we want to basically take them on a journey and help signpost to information that they're most interested in. And we want to create a kind of family of websites, both our partner websites and other daughter websites, that will get them to where they need to go. So in 2014, we had our new website, and basically it was structured around taking people on a journey. So getting informed in the state of Scotland's environment, understanding the data that underpins that assessment, getting more interactive with the data, with data visualization, understanding your local environment, and not just data tools that we ourselves as Scotland's Environment Web publish, but also providing a recommended resource list of a whole range of different data analysis tools that have been published by our partners. Not only understanding the state of the environment, we really want to encourage people to get involved in the environment, get involved in discussing your environmental priorities, getting involved in action and observing the environment, and engaging young people. And then we wanted to get communicating. Huge shift, even since writing this project bid, in terms of the role of social media, instant communication, in terms of how people are sharing information, how people are finding out about things. So really kind of getting to grips with that angle in terms of how we can collectively get key environmental issues out there and engage people in understanding the environment. So some key features of the website going forward: we obviously have the State of Environment Report, that was published on the 5th of June. Underpinning that, we're doing some work around the indicators and data, so making much more visible and accessible and linked to the State Environment Report is the actual raw data that underpins it. You'll hear about in the spatial mapping tools workshop this afternoon, how we've developed new tools and increased significantly the functionality of our mapping tools, not only to view map data, but also developing tools that inform key business decisions for particular sectors. Data visualization, again, there's a Spotify workshop this afternoon about how we transform data into more usable graphs and images, much greater use of things like infographics to explain environmental issues. Paul will talk about, hopefully, the Project Finder and the role of Project Finder as part of connecting volunteers with projects, environmental action, citizen science projects. Mobile apps, they're taking over the world, but there's some brilliant environmental apps out there, not only in terms of finding out about your local environment, but also helping to collect data and extending our monitoring network. Engaging young people in discussion and youth competition, promotion, I mentioned social media. And that little graph in the corner really shows how we want to start growing that family of websites. We have Scotland Soils, and I think we have Willie Towers here with any information or questions you've got about the Scotland Soils website. He'll be here to answer any queries. We have Scotland's Aquaculture, and we're doing some work with the National Biodiversity Network on a biodiversity-related daughter website around Atlas for Living. The potential is huge, and the good thing about daughter websites is they differ because they maybe have provided data publishing platforms. So where there is an issue where there's no one natural data owner, partners can come together, create a daughter website on a specific environmental theme and basically publish the data. But you can benefit from Scotland's environment by sharing the templates, the business processes, the branding, and help that user on the connected journey and sharing environmental information. So what? This is the kind of question we get asked. There's so many environmental websites out there, so why should I bother going to Scotland's Environment Web? What's in it for me? Why should I bother? And there are a range of benefits, I think, to both users and data providers alike. And these are just a flavour of some of those. Is greater transparency and accountability. I think from the partners, helping them to tap into audiences they hadn't actually been able to tap into before, and creating that wider network, increased profile, but also wider use of data. And that really helps to extend the reach and influence collectively we all have. This centralised source of evidence, again, you don't have to go across many different websites to find what you're looking for. You can get to the one's portal, you can get to the information you're looking for quickly. And basically using data to inform decision making and transform complex data. And I think going forward, we want to help people get that more personalised view of my environment, my place, and what is it doing for me. So going forward, Scotland's Environment Web, we still want to innovate, although that's becoming increasingly difficult with the fast pace of change with things, and even just keeping up is challenging enough. But as the public sector partnership we have, we are innovating just by keeping up with the world out there. We want to carry on demonstrating and, very importantly, sharing our learning, sharing our experiences and knowledge, and that's around more collaborative work. And we want to create a web of data providers, data users. We want to share knowledge and data, make much better value from it, have this user journey of connected websites, connectivity with information, and importantly, not just put data out there, but really create a network of environmental scientists, observers, and most importantly, stewards. And that can only be to the benefit of the environment, to society, and our economy. So what I would say is please take a look at the website. We're always looking for ideas and comments and feedback. So let us know what you think. Give us any new ideas for new data you might have or new applications you might have. And please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions to Joe about the journey, and then you'll introduce the workshops after that. Excellent. Just hold if you don't mind, I'm attached to it.
Alex Ramage from Transport Scotland. It's fabulous the visualisation that you've put in. How are you meeting the needs of the visually impaired community?
Very good question. So we do try and we do on the website do an accessibility review of the information. We do try and incorporate accessibility issues. What I would say is any comments that we have in terms of how we might be able to improve that would be welcomed in terms of the visually impaired community. And what we're also trying to do is maybe support some of the visualization tools with other forms of, I suppose, explaining some of the data and information. So, for example, some people who can't read lots of text with some of the help text on the applications, we want to try and do a very quick sound bites and video type user guidance journey, not just in terms of how to use the tools, but how to understand the data. But any comments you've got on how we can make any improvements would be really helpful. Thanks for the comment.
Hi Joe, thanks, that was very good. Alex Kinninman from the Scottish Wildlife Trust. I know the SE Web and the State of Scotland's Environment Report has a lot of marine information in there, and then also the Scotland's Aquaculture website sits under the SE Web platform. But parallel to all of that, there's also Scotland's Marine Atlas, Marine Plan Interactive, and Scotland's Marine Planning Tool. Is there any plans or appetite to bring those different strands closer together and essentially avoid duplication?
I think the point is you don't have to necessarily bring everything under the one tool. From a user's perspective, they just want to get to it quickly. So there's no point in us duplication, replacing a fantastic tool like the National Marine Plan Interactive. But what I think we could do is help people get to that very quickly. So from Scotland's Environment Web, we could helpfully bring more traffic to things like the Marine Plan Interactive tool, but also the Marine Plan Interactive tool reciprocally link back to Scotland's Environment Web. So what we found is people don't necessarily care where things are published as long as they can get to it quickly and easily. So I think our challenge is how we can help people get to tools like that. And we don't necessarily have to bring them in. What we are interested in, if there's any element of data sharing between the respective tools we've got to help people see marine data in the context of wider environmental information, and likewise we can signpost people to marine data when they want that more specialised look. I think that's the journey we're going to be taking.
Thank you. Any other questions to Joe from the floor? One up there.
Peter Singleton from SEPA. Joe, I maybe put you on the spot a bit here, but I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about the future. So what SEPA's plans are over the next years?
Okay, in
quick plug.
I'd just like to point out that Peter is my boss. And I thank him kindly for that question.
There's a bucket outside to donations, by the way.
So in terms of the future, we heard before from James that SEPA have continued their support to Scotland's Environment Web. So the brilliant thing is when the life funding finishes in August, this will not all be switched off. It will all carry on, and what we have is we're recruiting a permanent development team. So what that does, it brings certainty to our partners and people publishing data that where they feel they're in discussion about, well, if we're looking at data information applications, where best might they sit, either on our own websites or maybe want to collaboratively work with Scotland's Environment Web, that certainty is there that they can be confident that their investment will continue in the future. And that's what we want to do. We want to kind of grow Scotland's Environment Web to be the gateway, and it's getting that critical mass of information, helping people on that journey, helping people more on that journey of discoverability. So at the moment, I think in terms of the website, it's great if you know what you're looking for, but we need to help people more find some information. But also what we want to do is try and create this family of websites and this shared environmental information resource, and that might be making better connections to new existing websites or creating new daughter websites. So we're working with a management group for new ideas, and that might require new partnerships, it might require new funding, but essentially we have a foundation in Scotland's Environment Web that I think is a great platform for us to build on.
Oh, well, I've got time for one more very quick question, actually, I think.
Hi there, Adam Florence from East Renfrewshire Council. One of the main things I found, I suppose, is just in any council with constraints on money and stuff, is getting people with different sort of kind of specialities together to actually create policy in a better way that can get management buy-in, really. Because the problem we have is that we're more greenhouse gas specific. I was trying to kind of get some communication between Resource Efficient Scotland with this, and I was just wondering, is there anything that you, Scotland's Environment, are doing with Resource Efficient Scotland to get more engagement with sort of kind of local council workers, to get them more involved so everyone's on the same page, so it's easier to put policy forward, but also marry that towards eco-schools initiatives as well, you know, for children as well, because I find that the more difficult thing is to get people in education, other sustainability officers or anything, if there is in a local government, if there's money, but overall to kind of marry this maybe with Resource Efficient Scotland a bit better, so we can work together to kind of get people more engaged, because I find that that's not really happening.
Yeah. So on the Eco Schools side, I would recommend Stuart. Are you here? Do you want to wave your hands? So Stuart McGrath is somebody that's Scotland's Environment Web and Education Scotland. We funded a post, and a lot of what Stuart's doing is creating new education resources for environment linked to the Eco Schools topics. And we've got new web pages to be launched very soon, which will provide a lot of that information. And actually, I don't know if you're going to the Engaging Young People workshop this afternoon, but you certainly hear more about that this afternoon, or take one of our business cards and we can get contact from you, and we can certainly put you in touch around that. On the local authority side, yes, we absolutely want to be doing more with local authorities and developing the tools that will help local authorities bring these different specialisms together to create that cut of your local environment, your local environmental information. One thing we found challenging, though, is with all 32 local authorities, everyone does it slightly different. And it's how we get out there. And one of the ideas we've got is to kind of pick some kind of champion authorities to kind of test the water, get them as kind of champion benchmark authorities, then we can encourage others to do the same. So if you're interested in working with Scotland's Environment Web and you've got ideas around Resource Efficient Scotland, it'd be great to hear from you, because you know more about how local authorities work than probably we do in SEPA. So any advice you can give us on how best to engage with councils in that forum would be really helpful.
I'll just go and get his name and contact details.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think I'm going to have to stop. There was one more question, but maybe you could catch Joe at lunchtime if that's okay. Okay, Joe, you've got a few minutes now. Yep. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. Lots of enthusiasm for us to carry on as a partnership to take this forward. You're now going to introduce the workshops for us.
Yes.
But before that, I might say goodbye to our web streamers. We haven't had very many questions from them. Well, they're leaving in 4 minutes, actually, apparently. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. And if you have got any more questions, you've got 4 minutes to get them through to us, and we can answer them at our leisure online. Okay, Joe?
Thanks. So,